Hey everybody, welcome back to Dead Reckoning. Above the Paygrade, I'm Jay Friesen with
Brian Mattson.
Very good. And with
Very good. I'm glad you approve of how I said my name. Very good.
Very good, sir.
We got a great guest
We're
today.
here with the first ever returning guest on the show. We had him on when we were doing our podcast.
He's the only sucker we've convinced to come back onto the show.
And I would be very careful about calling this man a sucker.
That's for sure.
He's one of the most talented legal minds that exist right now, and published author Shon Hopwood. Shon, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so just a brief rehearsal. You were on, you joined us for one of our podcasts earlier this year, and I'm sure that a lot of our viewers maybe haven't listened to that podcast. Shame. But let's get a brief recap. You were the author of Lawman, which is a story about what?
Well, the subtitle, which is and I always love seeing people's reactions when I tell them the subtitle. I just did that at a Bible study last night.
Nice.
And they said, "What's the book about?" And I said, "My story of robbing banks, winning Supreme Court cases, and finding redemption." And then their face usually goes,
You're what? Robbing banks, winning Supreme Court cases.
And then they ask if it's a novel, and then I tell them it's a memoir, and then they look just perplexed.
I bet they do.
And so it's the story of, when I was in my early 20s, I committed 5 armed bank robberies and went to federal prison and spent over 10 and a half years in federal prison. While I was there, I learned the law and started writing legal briefs for other prisoners, and was blessed enough to have the U.S. Supreme Court grant 2 of the petitions I prepared for other prisoners. I started winning cases kind of all over, and was eventually released in 2008. Worked at a place that helped lawyers all over the country file briefs to the Supreme Court, and then finished my undergrad degree, and am now a law school student at the University of Washington School of Law.
Okay, but let's not gloss over, Shon, the important part. You got the girl in the end, man.
Oh yeah, she's the big, getting the Supreme Court to grant your petition is I explain, it's like winning the legal lottery. The odds are very much against you. But I have to say, I think the odds of me marrying my wife were probably even longer, because she's an incredibly beautiful, incredibly intelligent person, and really could have chose anyone she wanted. And, to this day, no one really knows why she chose me, and including my own mom says, "And And so, that was a pretty big part of the story. Annie started writing me while I was in prison. We became very good friends through letters. And when I got out, she was there and drove me around to job interviews. And when I was finally released from custody, released from the federal halfway house, I proposed 2 weeks later.
Wow,
that's so cool.
She said yes.
That's terrific. Now, Shon, people can find all about you, what you're up to, what you're doing is it ShonHopwood.com?
Yep.
So that's S-H-O-N, Shon Hopwood, just how it sounds.com. And I know that I've seen a video that you did with your wife on your website where you guys both kind of talked about your stories and how you ended up together. And I thought it was very poignant and moving, and it was really, really terrific.
Yeah, so pick it up, check it out. Now, the cool part is and I was really excited because I actually asked Shon if I could buy the film rights to his book, his life story. He's like, "Wow, man." He's like, "That'd have been great, but I just sold the rights to a television producer. Granted, much bigger than me, I'm much more established, but they've actually called for a pilot of a series based on you. I heard it's kind of a CSI sort of thing."
It is. I went to LA and pitched this idea to NBC and CBS about early October. And the idea is about a jailhouse lawyer that gets out and goes to work, of all places, for a federal prosecutor working in the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. And he kind of helps the prosecutor solve some of these cases based on, not only his legal knowledge, but the knowledge that he's picked up in prison. He can kind of sniff out the BS quicker than the other people in the office can. And so that's kind of the premise of the story, and NBC bought the pilot, and we'll probably shoot the pilot this winter, and in May, they will make a decision as to whether we're on the air next fall.
Man, that's so cool.
That is super cool. Now, so obviously that's more of that's sort of loosely based on your life and your ideas.
Very loosely based.
Very loosely based. But I'm wondering. So that's I guess I would classify that as almost like a spin-off sort of idea. I mean, is there anybody that's shown interest into film rights to Lawman? I mean, your actual.
There has been, but it's really difficult these days to get a non-comic book movie made in Hollywood.
Yeah, well, that's true.
And with the TV industry, things happen quick and you get answers right away. And the agents thought that this would just be a better opportunity. That doesn't foreclose the opportunity of someone wanting to do a movie later on. It just makes it a little more difficult because they would be talking to the people that bought the rights to Lawman rather than me.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
So, Shon, into the current world, the real world, not this fictionalized, glorified world where you're good-looking driving a Ferrari. And
he is good-looking, but he might not have a Ferrari.
Well, we know we're always self-deprecating as men. But a feed, and I don't know how it came up in my recent news feed, but I contacted you here last week because 29,000 prisoners went on a hunger strike, and this happened back in June. And I know we've talked about prison reform before, but it's kind of like it all came to a head because our pastor in church on Sunday was talking. He was preaching out of Romans, talking about the role of government in institutions and in justice and crime and punishment, and all these kind of things came together, and it was like, let's get Shon on to talk to us a little bit about what you're doing in prison reform, because as you've expressed before, it's kind of your
and what are your areas,
your cup of tea.
What are the? I mean, I think that most people don't have a clue that there is such a thing as a movement for prison reform. What are the big issues?
Well, they have a name for it. It's the system of mass incarceration, and by that I mean the United States leads the world in incarceration rates. We incarcerate more people than China, even though they have a couple billion more people than we do. Currently, we have 2.2 million people in prison. And so it would be like if we just locked up Houston tomorrow. And that's a pretty big number. And, I'd tell you that there are many people that need to go to prison and stay there. But the majority of the people I saw were, very much redeemable, very much could turn it around if given the opportunity. And we just use incarceration as a first resort rather than as a last resort in this country. And so I go around talking about these issues. In September, I had the opportunity to submit written testimony to the United States Senate Judiciary Committee about a bill that would allow judges to sentence below mandatory minimum sentences.
Right.
Next week, I'm going to go talk to the Washington legislature about prison reentry and some of the things we can do to help prisoners when they come out. Currently, about 2/3 of prisoners that are released will go back to prison within 3 years. And not only is it a waste of humanity, but in my home state of Washington, it costs the taxpayers $46,000 a year to house one prisoner. That's a pretty big number, and we got to quit doing things the way we're doing because it's just not working. And so those are some of the things. I go to legislatures. I sometimes even have to go to churches and convince Christians that prisons are redeemable. And I tell them the same thing I tell everybody. Jesus can work miracles if you let him.
You just mentioned testifying about the mandatory minimum issue. My father, of course, is a lifelong career court reporter in the federal system. So I've grown up and spent a lot of time around the federal courts, and of course, mandatory minimums, are the rule in the federal system. There's no parole system in federal. Yes. And people don't know that there's not parole. There's some reduction of sentences with good time and stuff like that, but generally, your sentence is what you serve. And
you have to serve 85%.
Yeah, 85, and that's if you're good, right? And you don't look at a prison guard wrong or behave. Yes. But the idea of the mandatory minimum is we want total uniformity in sentencing for various crimes, and I have long believed in the fundamental injustice of that. You have cases where you have a criminal conspiracy charge for people who are manufacturing or running drugs. And under the conspiracy count, you're giving 20 years for a conviction on a conspiracy count. Well, the 18-year-old girlfriend who drove the drugs across town is now getting the same sentence as the head honcho of the whole thing, right? I mean, isn't that how this is working?
Yeah, and that's one of the problems is we are all unique individuals, and most crimes, it's not an equal, people aren't equally guilty in these crimes. And so, it's trying to use a one-size-fit-all approach. The case I related to the U.S. Senate is a case almost identical to mine. A man that was 22 years old committed 9 armed robberies of massage parlors in Philadelphia with a gun. No one was hurt. And really, the only difference between his case and my case was my prosecutor was reasonable. I pled guilty, received a 12-year sentence. His prosecutor was not reasonable. He went to trial, lost, and received a 213-year sentence.
Wow.
213 years for a crime that normally carries 10 to 15. And this guy, Adam Clausen, is now a model prisoner. And unless the Congress or the president does something, we will have to pay to keep him in prison for his entire life.
Yeah. And that's 213 years because probably under the federal guidelines, the sentences probably have to run consecutively, right?
They do. And mandatory minimums have just taken the discretion away from judges and given it to prosecutors. And the prosecutors meet the defendant for maybe 2 or 3 minutes at an arraignment and make some subjective judgment call right then about whether this person will get a second chance or whether we'll just bury them.
And it strikes me also
ridiculous.
Yeah, it strikes me also that it's actually undermines the very concept of having a judge. I mean, why don't we have robots do it, right? The whole purpose of having a judge is somebody who is wise. And I'm thinking in terms of God's appointing of judges. I mean, in the Bible, when you read the Old Testament, and what are the qualifications for somebody? Wisdom is the big thing. We want somebody who's wise, who can discriminate between these cases. And man, I mean, we might as well just have a computer program spit out sentences, right?
Yeah, I mean, how the system currently is the federal prosecutors combined with the U.S. Sentencing Commission decide the sentence. It's not the judge. And so do we want basically bureaucrats deciding the sentence, or do we want federal judges that are actually meeting these people, looking them in the eye, and getting all of this information about them prior to sentencing and actually having a reasoned judgment about what the sentence should be?
This is kind of making me a little bit angry hearing about this, and I think it's making me angry because of my sense of justice.
Sure.
That this is not being just when we need to exercise justice in criminal prosecution. And I think it comes back to what you said, is that when there's room for reform, we're not doing it. We're not capitalizing on it. We're simply spitting out these things all over the place. And I guess that, for me, might be some of the, and you can probably expound on this a little bit more, Shon, but why Christians should be involved and active in this field. I mean, we've seen social justice be like the big thing in the last couple of years, but this is an area that's is going very under,
a little bit. I mean, you can't just bracket out Chuck Colson and Prison Fellowship.
No, I'm not bracketing out Chuck, but growing up, he was kind of a niche thing, and my daily life living for a God of redemption, a God of who redeems, who changes people, does not meet
the prisoner.
The prisoner.
Yeah.
There's no application, but there's tons of parallel there.
There are tons of parallels, and for non-Christians, it's the thought that once a criminal, always a criminal. Now, as Christians, we know that's not true. We know that Jesus can work miracles in people's lives and can redeem them. But for even the non-Christian, I say, the guy you're talking to now is 38, married with 2 kids. Different guy than when I was 22. I don't know many people that aren't 38 years old that don't look back on things they did in their early 20s and say, wow, I can't believe I did that. I would never even think about doing that today. I've literally had federal judges, federal prosecutors, U.S. Marshals, cops come up to me and say, you know, Shon, I know you get a lot of judgment, but if I had gotten caught for some of the things I did in my 20s, I wouldn't be in this job today. And I think that describes most people.
Right.
You know, I don't know most people that can't say they've not made some pretty significant changes from 22 to 38.
Yeah, and to be clear, I mean, I think that you're not talking about just any kind of mistake. I mean, obviously, you know, you didn't murder somebody. I mean, you're talking about there is a difference, of course, between violent crime and nonviolent crime, and assault and murder and these sorts of things. So I don't hear you as saying, gee, we ought to let everybody off the hook because people do bad things when they're 20. You know, obviously there's a difference, right?
But I'm saying that people have the capacity to change.
Yeah.
Most people have the capacity to change. Christians and people that come under grace especially have the capacity to change. So why is it that we as a society think that prisoners are unable to be redeemable?
Right.
And that's a message I talk about with Christians and non-Christians alike.
Well, you know, and it's not even as, it's more than just, hey, I'm going to go out and I'm going to be good. It's like, you know, when Christ comes into the picture, if you're a Christian working within the prison system, when Christ comes into that picture and does that change, it's him doing the changing, not you. And so your changing is going to be far more sticky than otherwise. You know, it's going to stick with you. You know?
Yeah, right. You're not just pulling
You're still
yourself
going to
up by your
struggle, but it's going to,
right.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's great.
You know, one of the reasons I became a Christian, and it didn't happen until after I left prison, was I saw how Christians acted in prison. They were very much an outlier. They acted differently than other prisoners, and most of them weren't fake about it. You didn't see the guys that were devout Christians going to church and then downstairs in the rec room gambling and playing dice and poker. You didn't see that. They really stuck out of the prison system, and just how they carried themselves really impacted how I viewed Christians.
That's just terrific. Well, Shon, we really, really appreciate you coming on the show and helping educate us and our viewers about an issue that people just don't think about. It is not on their radar. You know, the way we incarcerate people in this country, and I'm really glad you're doing it, and all the best to you. Thanks so much for sharing with us.
Well, thank you, and I would encourage people to get involved with Prison Fellowship. I know a lot of people there. I'm getting involved. It's just a really amazing group. It's the largest prison ministry on the planet.
Yeah.
And they do a whole lot of good in the world.
Yeah, I was going to ask where people can get involved. So that's what
Prison Fellowship.
Chuck Colson's Prison Fellowship. If you want to find out more about Shon, ShonHopwood.com, and buy a copy of his book. My wife read it to me on a road trip, and I was just like, this is amazing. They need to make a TV show about it, and somebody had a good idea like I did.
Terrific story. Yeah,
terrific story. Shon, thanks for coming on the show. I'm Jay Friesen.
I'm Brian Mattson.
And this is Dead Reckoning.